A History of the Yoruba People. Adebanji Akintoye. The Politics of the 20th Century. The Yoruba people entered the 20th century as subjects of alien European powers, some in the French Protectorate of Dahomey, a very small part in German, later French, Heligoland, Togo, and the rest in the British colony and Protectorate of Nigeria. The parts which went to Dahomey, later the Republic of Benin, and Togo amounted, together, to only a small slice of Yoruba territory and population. We will first examine the history of the Yoruba people outside Nigeria in the 20th century. Yoruba kingdoms under French rule. First, the Nigeria-Dahomey boundary through Yorubaland was a constant source of vexation and trouble, especially to the Yoruba in Dahomey, almost throughout the colonial era. Not only did the boundary separate these people from their kinsfolk in Nigeria, more importantly, it placed many of the subordinate towns and villages of their kingdoms beyond the border in Nigeria. This created the situation that whenever any of these split kingdoms tried to act like a kingdom together, their action contravened the international boundary. For instance, in important traditional functions, like the appointment and installation of their local rulers and chiefs, towns and villages on the Nigerian side of the border expected, and asked, their king beyond the border to perform his traditional role, and the king just had to act accordingly. Sometimes also, the towns and villages wanted to send their traditional dues or gifts to their king beyond the border. On the whole, the local British officials on the Nigerian side proved to be quite understanding in these matters. In fact, when confronted with succession disputes in communities on the Nigerian side, British officials sometimes sought the opinion and advice of the appropriate king beyond the border. In contrast, the French officials in Dahomey were usually very hostile in these situations, especially in the years after 1900. Hence the fact that Yoruba kings in Dahomey were frequently arrested, charged with treason, convicted, and imprisoned or banished into exile. Second, French colonial policy proved, in general, much more destructive of Yoruba traditional political institutions than British policy was. In the first few years of French rule up to 1900, French local officials, called residents, were ideally supposed to relate to the Yoruba kingdoms as protectorates, and to address and treat their kings as indeed kings of their people. In those years, French repressive vigilance was reserved for the Dahomey kingdom, while the situation in the Yoruba kingdoms could be described as one of indirect rule. But from 1900, as the abiding character of French colonial policy evolved, their handling of the Yoruba kingdoms changed. Between 1900 and 1914, the French moved decisively for direct administration. The position of residents was abolished and replaced with that of commandants, and the number of local French officials was considerably increased as the whole area was broken into smaller administrative units called cantons. The kings ceased to be kings, and became chefs de canton, in which position they were merely administrative auxiliaries to the French administrators. The canton over which each king was chef was usually a small part of his traditional kingdom, and over it his duties were strictly stated and circumscribed. In theory, he could hold a court, but real judicial authority lay in the hands of the French administrator. The king's principal functions in his canton were to transmit the administrator's orders to his people, and to assist in the recruitment of labor, the collection of taxes, and conscription to armed service duties, which progressively made him unpopular with his people. These conditions led to resentment and reactions, which then produced almost constant conflicts between the French administration and the Yoruba traditional authorities. The French response was to withhold confidence more and more from the Yoruba rulers and to vest it in chiefs of their own creation, lowly citizens whose only claim to such political elevation was their known loyalty to the French. The increasing use of such persons only added to the resentment, the reactions and the conflicts. Of course, the Yoruba kings and those loyal to them were always the losers in these conflicts. The consequences were, first, a great instability in the position of the traditional rulers, as many of them went to prison, to banishment, or to self-exile abroad. Some of the traditional thrones were then left vacant for long periods of time. The second consequence was the steady decline in the influence and prestige of all traditional political institutions. When French rule over their Dahomey protectorate finally ended in 1960, most of the Yoruba communities in the new Republic of Dahomey entered into the independence era with their traditional political institutions in, according to Anthony Asiwaju, a state of collapse. In 1994, some citizens of the Benin Republic initiated the founding of a Conseil des Rois, Council of Kings, for the purpose of creating a forum through which the traditional rulers of the country could begin to influence the country's development. Of the Yoruba Aba of the Benin Republic, the Ile-Ife of Ketu played a prominent role in the founding of this body. Though the political, social or economic role of this Conseil des Rois did not become clear as the 20th century came to an end, Its creation was nevertheless some sign that the traditional rulers, largely suppressed under French colonial rule, might yet revive and play significant roles in the modern history of the Benin Republic. Yoruba traditional rulers in Nigeria in the 20th century. The political leadership of Yoruba people in the last decade of British rule and in independent Nigeria was provided by the new class of Western-educated men and women. That was the common experience of all tropical African peoples in the 20th century. After the kings had lost control over their kingdoms to the British overlord, the task of organizing and leading the Yoruba people and of confronting the agencies of British rule fell completely into the hands of the Western-educated, most of them primarily the products of the Christian mission schools. And when the British finally bowed out, it was to the class of the Western-educated that they handed the instruments of government in the country of Nigeria to which the Yoruba then belonged. However, traditional Yoruba political institutions only stepped down from center stage. They did not, at least in Nigeria, cease to exist. Indeed, as far as the broad masses of Yoruba people in Nigeria were concerned, the king and the palace continued to represent deep-seated traditions and values that the modern government of elected politicians and bureaucrats could not. First then, we will look at the fortunes of the Yoruba traditional rulers under British rule, and then in independent Nigeria. The dealings of the British officials with the Yoruba centers of power were very rough in the first years of British rule in Nigeria. Their first concern was about the many war chiefs who commanded large followings, had arsenals of weapons, and wielded enormous influence in almost all parts of Yorubaland. British local officials in various parts of the country made it a priority to show these men that the era of wars had ended, as had their power. First, the British officials asked the war chiefs to disband their crowds of clients and war boys. From the compounds and military bases of many warriors, streams of people issued forth and flowed to all parts of the country. Though probably most of the followers of the Ibadan war chiefs chose to continue to live in Ibadan, the crowds that arrived from Ibadan in Ekiti, Ijesa, Akoko, the country of the Okan Yoruba, Igbamina and the towns and villages of the Osun Valley were still considerable. From the fact that many of the Ekiti, Ijesa and Akoko among them had picked up Oyo dialect in Ibadan, they became known, in Ekiti and Akoko, as the Itoyobo, the arrivals from Oyo. Most of those who left from Ogdemjib's group in Ile-Ife or from Ajilaju and Emisi Lazajidi headed towards Akoko in the country of the Okan Yoruba. In late 1894 or early 1895, Ajilaju at last returned home from Emisi Lazajidi to Adu, accompanied by a family that numbered in the hundreds, and established a sprawling compound. Most of the breaking up of the war chiefs' large followings went peacefully, making it unnecessary for British officials to employ a show of force. When, however, some of the chiefs were asked to send away even their close circle of trusted attendants, and to surrender or destroy their arsenals, some resistance surfaced. And such resistance provoked the arrest and incarceration of some chiefs, including some of the Ibadan chiefs who were believed to be unwilling to give up the career of warfare. Ogdemjib, who was arrested and exiled to Iwo in 1894 and was not allowed to return home to Ile-Ife until 1896, and Ajilaju, Fabinmi and Osuwakariel, a young veteran of the Akoko Wars, by then the Igbiti of Adu and Ekiti, all of whom were taken to the British outpost at Okimo near Ile-Ife, detained for some time, warned and released. Ogdemjib's arrest did not go without physical resistance. A few of his closest men drew their swords to defend their chief, but Ogdemjib commanded them to put their swords away. He was then arrested, and some quantity of arms and ammunition was taken away from his compound. By 1900, the power of the war chiefs had been eliminated. They remained men of considerable fame and influence, to be sure, but the kind of independent authority enjoyed by them until about 1893 was gone. In Ibadan, the division between a civil and a military line of chiefs vanished, and Ibadan became a typical Yoruba monarchical state, with the Baal, later Ali Ibadan, as head. In Ilorin, the titles of the war below guns became subsumed under the general chieftaincy system, under the king or emir. In Abeokuta, the kind of preeminence enjoyed by the chiefs over affairs disappeared. Direct British defeat of the Ijebu army in 1892 had eliminated the military as an important factor in Ijebu affairs. After that, whatever military title remained was absorbed into the traditional chieftaincy system or became honorary. Many of the Ala guns of eastern Yorubaland accepted the traditional chieftaincy titles of their ancestors. For instance, Ogdemjib became the Obanla of Ile-Ife, Ajilaju was invested with the title of the Adimo, the title of his forebears, on his deathbed. Fahembala of Igisi in the Oi kingdom had taken the traditional title of Alugbosan even while the Kyrgyz war was on. In Adu, Ekiti, Osuwakariel was made the Igbiti, traditional second-in-command of the U.S. Army, and Faparusi returned from his camp to be honored with his father's traditional title of Osolo. The people of the Old Kingdom of Ile invited Prince Fabianmi and crowned him their king. In effect, what the fate of the war chiefs in the first years of British rule represented was a resuscitation of the old monarchical system of the Yoruba people in its pre-19th century purity but now under British overlordship. The traditional rulers, the Aba and the subordinate Bales, and, below them, the various cadres of traditional chiefs, stood forth again as the undisputed indigenous leaders of Yoruba communities. For the British local officials, this represented a simplification of the political field. To implement the policies of British overlordship, all they had to do was to deal with the Aba. In such dealings, during the first few years of British rule, the British travelling commissioners and their soldiers, policemen and clerks, paid little respect to the kings and chiefs, but generally tended to terrorise and bully them. The stated objective was to restore and maintain peace in a country that had been long torn by wars. The most violent of these acts of repression was perpetrated in Oyo town in 1895 by Captain Bauer, the resident of Ibadan and travelling commissioner. Captain Bauer's action against the Ile-Ife Adeyemi and his town had no legal justification whatsoever. It was an arbitrary demonstration of British military power, the objective of which was to intimidate and suppress the Ile-Ifan, even though he showed friendliness to British officials and contravened no clause of his treaty with them. After the Ile-Ifan's palace had tried and punished 2 offenders, both of them subjects of the Ile-Ifan, Bauer queried the Ile-Ifan and demanded that he should surrender the 2 men to him. Since Bauer had no legal authority for such demands, the Ile-Ifan and his chiefs refused. Bauer then escalated his demands, going so far as to require the Ile-Ifan to surrender the palace official who had carried out the punishments on the 2 offenders and even that the Ile-Ifan should prostrate to him. Early in the morning of November 12, Bauer mounted the 7-pounder at the gate of Oyo and ordered a wholesale bombardment of the town. The palace and many of the houses of Oyo were destroyed, the Ile-Ifan himself was wounded, uncounted Oyo citizens were killed, and the ancient government of Oyo was completely subjugated. No other Yoruba ruler or town saw a comparable scale of violent repression and unlawful use of power, but to the traditional rulers of the rest of Yorubaland, this act of terror at Oyo became an intimidating object lesson. From the beginning of the 20th century, however, changes began slowly to appear. In the years after 1914 especially, the Lugardian system of indirect rule, evolved by the British in the Emirates of northern Nigeria, was introduced in Yorubaland also. During the 1920s and 1930s, the system matured. In general, it meant at the local government level the official recognition of the Yoruba Oba as a native authority, with a native police force, a native court, and a native treasury. The local British official was the district officer. The districts were grouped into provinces, each province under an official called the resident. In southern Nigeria there thus arose 4 Yoruba provinces: Ijebu Province, Abeokuta Province, Oyo Province, and Ondo Province, and in northern Nigeria Ilorin Province and Kaba Province, each of these 2 having some non-Yoruba components. The Yoruba provinces of southern Nigeria, together with the neighboring Benin Province and Delta Province, were constituted into the western provinces of Nigeria under a lieutenant governor based in the city of Ibadan. The Kingdom of Lagos, being legally a crown colony, while the rest of Nigeria's Yoruba people were part of the Protectorate of Nigeria, was given a pattern of administration outside of, and somewhat different from, the one outlined above. Nonetheless, there was no real difference in the positions of the Lagos and other Yoruba kings under British rule. On the whole, under indirect rule, the Yoruba traditional ruler in Nigeria enjoyed a certain level of respect and influence, as well as a certain amount of authority, which his brethren in Dahomey never enjoyed under French rule after 1900. Of course, it must not be forgotten that the reality of indirect rule was frequently different from its ideal. For instance, the district officer was, ideally, supposed to be an advisor to the native authority, but, in fact, he was often more like a supervisor. Also, indirect rule was easier to implement in districts where one paramount ruler was easy to identify, like the Ile-Ife in Oyo or the Owa-Vilesa in Ijesa, or the Awujale of Ijebu-Ode in Ijebu. In any district where there was a plurality of equal traditional rulers, however, distortions crept in. The attempt by the British officials to simplify the situation by enforcing a paramount ruler of their own creation was, ultimately, an attempt to create illegitimate authority. For instance, the attempt to elevate one of the many Akiti kings to a position of paramountcy over the rest led to protests in the 1930s, protests so serious that the attempt had to be abandoned. A worse case occurred in Igbodo where a commoner, Siriki Abbas, was elevated to a position of paramount chief of the Western District in 1913, and senior chief of Ilaro Division in 191,419. When all this has been said, however, it still remains true that indirect rule under the British tended, on the whole, to preserve some of the prestige and dignity of the Yoruba kings, whereas French rule resulted in almost total destruction of Yoruba traditional political institutions. The native court system under indirect rule was particularly acceptable to Yoruba people, because it seemed to them to be proof that their kings were still in control, and most people would rather take their cases to the palace and the native court than to the alternative, and foreign, courts of magistrates and lawyers. On the whole, therefore, the Yoruba kings in Nigeria continued to be hailed as lieutenants of the gods by their subjects. A conference of the Ekiti kings, called Pelupilu, or Gathering of the Kings, met from time to consider matters placed before it concerning Ekiti. Each conference became a highly glorified festival in which the Ekiti kings competed in the show of traditional grandeur, shimmering, beaded, high-domed, Oduduwa crowns with dangling frills over the wearers' faces, flowing garments of richest texture, beaded shoes and scepters, all complete with buglers or trumpeters proclaiming the arrival of each king. For the people of Adu Ekiti, where most of the conferences were held, and for other Ekiti people who could make the journey there, each conference was a celebration, a time to fill the air with loud proclamations of the ancient Oriki for their kings. Variations of such royal grandeur were enacted in all parts of Yorubaland, perhaps the highest and most glistering often belonging to the Ile-Ife in Oyo. One Ile-Ife of the time, Siyanbola Ladigbolu, had a uniquely exalted hold on the grandeur of those times. In his masterful hands, the relationship between the king and the British resident, Captain William A. Ross, resident in Oyo from 1906 to 1933, so evolved that Ladigbolu became known among his subjects as Obadunpeyo and Baran-Nis, the king who sends white officials on errands. In fact, Ross regarded the Ile-Ife and Ladigbolu as friend and was single-mindedly dedicated to boosting the Ile-Ife's authority and influence over Oyo province, especially over the city of Ibadan. The British were, of course, the rulers of the land. Ultimate authority belonged to them. The district officers' court was superior to the native court, and served as a sort of court of appeal to it. The British had the last voice in the approval of any person selected for appointment as king. They also had the last voice in the removal of a king, as Adu Ekiti people were to discover to their shock when they tried to remove their king, Ile-Ife too, in 1942. Unable to employ, under the British, the traditional Yoruba means of removing a king, Adu chiefs and people resorted to civil commotion to achieve their purpose. Enraged by the U.S. show of disrespect to certain traditions, masses of Adu people, backed by their chiefs, poured into the streets, and a large stone-throwing mob besieged the palace. The UE escaped from the palace and from the town. The traditional chiefs and priests responsible for such matters then declared him dead, had royal funeral rites performed for him, and proceeded to select and install another prince as UE. The British government of Nigeria intervened, and ordered an investigation into the situation. The investigation came to the determination that, though Adebanji had infringed some traditions of his people, he had not broken any law of British Nigeria, and should be restored to his throne. On the day that he was to be brought back, some leading chiefs who could have considered plans for resistance were rounded up and brutally crushed by the police who had been drafted massively to the town. The UE Adebanji settled down after this, made his peace with his subjects, and ruled for nearly 5 decades, deeply beloved by his people. Thus ultimately British rule was absolute, upheld by police and military force. Even the Ile-Ife and Ladigbolu came to experience the absolute character of British rule from 1934 on, as Ross' successor, H. L. Ward Price, in implementation of changed British policies, rapidly demolished the extended authority and influence which the Ile-Ife had enjoyed over Ibadan up to 1933 while he watched in helpless alarm. Even so, Yoruba kings found ways to hold their heads high under the system and, occasionally, with impressive doses of traditional royal pomp and ceremony. In these years also, the Yoruba Oba stood forth as the traditional wing of the Yoruba national movement of solidarity and unity. Fortunately in this regard, the British administration instituted a periodic conference of the leading traditional rulers of the western provinces, including the Oba of Benin. The first of these very exalted conferences was held in 1937. In the years that followed, they became proud exhibitions of the grandeur of the traditional political system of the Yoruba nation. The climax was reached in about 194,950 with the founding of the prestigious association named Egbe Omo Oduduwa, Association of Oduduwa's Descendants. Comprising the rising political elite of the Yoruba people and the Aba, this association gave the Yoruba people, for over 1 decade, a solid, confident and glowing leadership in Nigeria. It was from its ranks that the politically active elite founded the first Yoruba-based political party, the Action Group, in 195,051. Meanwhile, beginning from as early as the 1920s, the new leadership of Nigeria by the literate elite had been evolving and confronting the British overlord. With the grant of limited self-government to Nigeria in 194,951, the Yoruba among the new elite emerged as essentially the rulers of the predominantly Yoruba Western provinces, by then the Western region, of Nigeria through elected legislatures, cabinet ministers, and local councils, all served by career civil servants. And with Nigeria's independence in 1960, the creation of the new dispensation was complete. Essentially, the new governments participated in by the Yoruba literate elite in Nigeria from 1952 represented a direct continuation of the imperial government of the British over and above the traditional governments of the Iba, and related to the Iba exactly as the British imperial government had used to relate to them. The Yoruba cabinet minister or premier of the Western region was an embodiment of a Yoruba government higher in every respect than any Yoruba monarch, and the Western House of Assembly in Ibadan, and the federal parliament in Lagos, made laws that every Oba, like every other citizen, must obey. If a Yoruba cabinet minister came from Ibadan or Lagos to visit an Iba domain, the Oba must receive him with all the respect with which he had used to receive the British resident or governor. The essence of the new dispensation was demonstrated most sharply in the mid-1950s when the elected government of the Western region, as part of its settlement of some political problems in Oyo, deposed one Ile-Ife and exiled him from his royal town. For the Yoruba people in the new dispensation, therefore, there arose a conflict between two important realities, the new system of power and government on the one hand, and, on the other, the powerful traditional hold of the Iba, and of the great traditions that they represent. For an accommodation to be found between the two, it would have to be found and effected by the men and women controlling the new instruments of power, the people in the local, regional and federal governments. These people showed little understanding of the moment's need in this regard, and, on the whole, did little that was of abiding fundamental significance about it. Yoruba makers of the new Nigerian constitution saw to the inclusion of a House of Chiefs in the constitution of the Western region, starting from 1952, and the Western region provided in the 1950s that Iba be presidents of the local councils in their domains. A president of a local council had no function other than to declare its meetings ceremonially open, and the position imperceptibly died out over time. The House of Chiefs existed until 1966, when the military seized control of all state governments in Nigeria. When elected governments returned in 1979, no mention was made of a House of Chiefs in any of the Yoruba-populated states in Nigeria, and no provision was made for it anywhere. As the 20th century rolled to an end, no consideration was given by the Yoruba elite to the issue of an appropriate role for the Iba in the new society and government of their people. Considerable respect for the Iba was shown by the first generation of Yoruba political leaders, of 195,262, but from then on, a slow decline in the level of respect was the rule. In subsequent years, most politicians tended to see the Iba and Bales in either of two lights: as a very influential institution to woo for electoral support, or as a very influential political obstacle to rage and rant against. Yet, as the 20th century closed, there was no sign that the Yoruba institution of monarchy, and the deep-rooted traditions around it, were dying or even weakening. In fact, on the contrary, Yoruba monarchy seemed to be reinventing itself and to be enhancing its influence anew. In all parts of Yoruba land, chiefs on the traditional committees of kingmakers showed an increasing preference for well-educated princes for selection as Iba. At the same time, more and more of such princes were not only willing to accept selection but were ambitious to seek it, and to give up highly paid, and otherwise prestigious, jobs in order to ascend the thrones of their forefathers. Some of the princes who were selected as kings in the late 20th century were even wealthy businessmen and owners of businesses, and such usually brought their businesses with them to the throne. Also, below the level of Iba and Bales, more and more of the best-paid men and women in the land were seeking to take on the traditional chieftaincies of their lineages. In fact, for the most successful, most educated, and wealthiest Yoruba men and women, a chieftaincy title, even if only honorary, had, by the end of the century, become a most highly sought status symbol. Without doubt, the traditional aura surrounding Yoruba political institutions appeared to be entering upon a new era of importance in modern Yoruba society. As yet, until the end of the century, the Yoruba attitude to having a rich businessman, owning and still running his businesses, on the throne was ambivalent. While probably most people regarded owning and running businesses as inappropriate for a Yoruba king, most nevertheless welcomed the enhanced ability of an educated and personally rich king to enlarge and glamorize the traditional dignity of the monarchy. What all these developments would ultimately translate to in the life of the Yoruba people in the modern world was not yet possible to tell as the 20th century came to an end. The Yoruba in Nigeria's politics. The above then is a brief account of the evolution of Yoruba traditional political institutions in Nigeria in the 20th century. That part of 20th century Yoruba history occupied a lesser level of importance than the experiences of the Yoruba people in the overall politics of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. It is in the evolution of Nigeria's political life that we see the overarching and most important developments affecting the Yoruba people of Nigeria in the course of the 20th century. Whatever, and how much, they accomplished in economic and social development in the course of the century was strongly impacted by the interrelationships and political interactions within Nigeria, and, for that reason, a slightly longer attention will here be given to 20th century Nigerian politics as it affected the Yoruba people. As is common with all African peoples, the 20th century political history of the Yoruba of Nigeria divides into two periods: the colonial period, and the period after independence. British rule over Yoruba land was consolidated in stages between 1893 and 1914, that is, if we exclude the Lagos Kingdom, which had become a British colony as early as 1861. By 1906, what later became the country of Nigeria was ruled under two separate British administrations, the Colony and Protectorate of Southern Nigeria, and the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. Most of Yorubaland was in the Colony and Protectorate of Southern Nigeria. The Yoruba city of Ilorin, most of Igbamina, the territories of the Okan Yoruba, and a thin slice of Ekiti, consisting of Moba and Obo kingdoms, were, as earlier stated, included in the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria. In 1914, the two protectorates were amalgamated, thus becoming two different components of the Colony and Protectorate of Nigeria. The whole country was then, as would be remembered, divided into provinces, of which the Lagos Colony, Ijebu Province, Abeokuta Province, Oyo Province and Ondo Provini in southern Nigeria were wholly Yoruba provinces, and the Ilorin Province and Kaba Province in northern Nigeria were partly Yoruba provinces. The northern Yoruba in northern Nigeria under British rule. The internal boundary between northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria continued, then, to consign to northern Nigeria the following parts of northern Yoruba land: Ilorin, most of Igbamina, part of the Ibilo, the Okan Yoruba, the northernmost Ekiti, and most of Akoko. Of these, after they instituted their system of indirect rule in northern Nigeria, the British administration consigned much of Igbamina, Ibilo and northern Ekiti to the Ilorin Emirate, and the rest of Igbamina to the Lafiaji Emirate later. All were included in a new province named Ilorin Province. Further to the northeast, the territories of the Okan Yoruba and the Akoko were organized together with their closest non-Yoruba neighbors, the Kakanda and the Nupkupa and Egan, to form a province Kaba Province, with its headquarters in the O-town of Kaba. Within this province, the Akoko and most of the Okan Yoruba, with the exception of the Oworo, were constituted into an emirate, the Kaba Emirate, under the Obaro of Kaba, and the Oworo, the Kakanda and the Nupkupa and Egan were constituted into another emirate, Agbaja Emirate, with Agbaja as headquarters and under the Olo of Oworo. Since neither the Obaro of Kaba nor the Olo of Oworo was a Muslim, neither could be titled emir, each was given the title of paramount chief. The emirate experiment in the Yoruba northeast quickly failed. In general, the Yoruba of these places viewed the emirate as a foreign Fulani system, and suspected that it represented a British attempt to extend Fulani influence over them. In the Agbaja Emirate, the Nupe and Kakanda, who were predominantly Muslim and non-Yoruba, immediately rejected their being put under a Yoruba chief who was not a Muslim. As for the Olo himself, he showed no interest in the position of paramount chief over peoples who were so culturally different from his own Oworo people, and he took no step to exercise the powers of the position. In consequence, the Agbaja Emirate experiment fizzled out. In the Kaba Emirate, the Akoko protested so vigorously that they were removed from the emirate and reassigned to southern Nigeria in 1919. Meanwhile, the Jammu and other Okan Yoruba set up intense protests against the paramountcy of the O-chief, the Obaro, with the result that the Kaba Emirate eventually broke up. In Ilorin Province, in contrast, the emirate system under indirect rule came to acquire the characteristics of the typical Fulani emirates of northern Nigeria beyond the Niger. As the British system of indirect rule evolved, they accorded the highest prestige to the northern Nigerian Fulani emirate system among all of Nigeria's indigenous political systems, and allowed the emirs considerable latitude in the administration of their emirates. Consequently, the British thus created the setting whereby the emirs of Ilorin could at last attempt to accomplish what had been impossible for them in the 19th century, namely, the imposition of a typical, thoroughgoing, Fulani emirate system on Ilorin and Igbamina, Ibilo and northern Ekiti in the new Ilorin Emirate. This immediately generated protests. In the conferences of the Ekiti kings, for instance, requests were repeatedly made to the British administration to return the northern Ekiti kingdoms of Moba and Obo to the Ekiti district of Ondo Province in southern Nigeria. As the British system of indirect rule matured, the protests intensified, because most of the Yoruba in Ilorin province found the system as it operated in the emirates of northern Nigeria harsh and repressive. Not only did the system of taxation and tax collection in these emirates cause resentment, so did the operation of the native court system. The Emir of Ilorin levied taxes on the farm harvests of Igbamina and Ibilo farmers, and appointed officials, called Babakekere, to whom various Igbamina and Ibilo communities were made subject to revival, more or less, of pre-British Ijel systems. These agents controlled the administration of all parts of the emirate, arbitrarily levied taxes, employed harsh and repressive, and sometimes even disruptive, methods to collect taxes, frequently demanded gifts from the communities subject to their authority, and abused the powers of the courts. The native courts were supposed to administer native law but, in fact, they were made to administer Islamic law, even though the populations of these places were predominantly non-Muslim. The emir also demanded of the Igbamina and Ibolo Aba that they should cease wearing traditional Yoruba crowns and wear lawani, the Arab headscarf used by Muslims. The emirs of Lafiaji operated in more or less the same ways. In short, in the emirates of Ilorin province, the British provided for the subjection of substantial parts of Yoruba people to the humiliation of indigenous cultural imperialisms. The resulting protests only gave the emirs, with the support of the local British officials, opportunities to exercise the rigor of their new powers over Yoruba Aba and commoners alike. The protests therefore came to feature many popular communal revolts, especially in the Igbamina towns. By the 1930s, the protests began to include protest migrations of many Igbamina, and also some of the Okan Yoruba, to parts of Yoruba land in southern Nigeria, particularly to places like Ogbomoso, Osogbo, Ibadan, Ife, and Lagos. In many of these places, the Igbamina immigrants quickly established themselves as very capable actors in the modern retail trade business. In Lagos in particular, where they usually started in menial jobs, their commercial skills and their prudence ultimately elevated many of them to rich traders and substantial owners of real estate properties. In the rich forest lands south of Ile-Ife, Igbamina farmers and plantation owners came to account for a major part of the expanding cocoa plantation industry. In spite of the various manifestations of protest, the British administration preserved intact its imposed splitting of Yoruba land into two in Nigeria, with the exception, as would be remembered, of the reassignment of Akoko to southern Nigeria in 1919, and of a small part of the Ekiti Kingdom of Moba, especially the town of Otun, to the Ekiti district of southern Nigeria in 1936. This heritage of subordination of parts of the Yoruba people to the dominant House of Fulani people of northern Nigeria was to continue throughout British rule and into the years after independence. And the heritage of Yoruba protests against it was to continue in the politics of Nigeria throughout all the constitutional exercises that gradually prepared Nigeria for independence in the 1950s, and also in the years after independence in 1960. Since size and population became, from the early 1950s, the determinant of a region's influence in the affairs of Nigeria, the House of Fulani leaders of the northern region were determined not to lose the Yoruba part of their region, and the British consistently supported them in that resolve. It was not until Nigeria was broken into smaller states in 1967, with the Yoruba of northern Nigeria becoming the dominant ethnic component of a new Kwara state, that this thorny matter was finally laid to some rest. Western region and Nigerian politics. In 1939, the Yoruba provinces of southern Nigeria plus the Benin and Delta provinces to the southeast were constituted as the Western region. By 1952, British concessions to Nigerian nationalist demands resulted in the predominantly Yoruba Western region being granted some measure of indigenous participation in its own administration. This led to the formation of political parties, to elections, and the appointment of Yoruba politicians as cabinet ministers in the government of the Western region, under the supervision of British officials. In 1956, the measure of indigenous participation in the government of the Western region was increased. Under this arrangement, called self-government, the indigenous regional administration, with its legislature, cabinet and premier, exercised nearly full control over all matters, with the British regional governor occupying the position of regional representative of the British Crown. In 1960, the whole of Nigeria attained full independence. The years after independence witnessed a steady growth of political crisis in Nigeria. In response to the important fact that Nigeria comprises many nationalities, the British makers of constitutions for Nigeria in the years before independence had structured the country as a federation of three regions, a northern region, a western region, and an eastern region. The northern region was made territorially coterminous with the former protectorate of northern Nigeria, consisting of the vast territory spreading from Nigeria's borders on the edge of the Sahara Desert to a line south of the two great rivers, Niger and Benue, and still including the Yoruba territories of Ilorin, most of Igbamina, the Okan Yoruba, and part of Ekiti. The eastern and western regions represented a splitting of the former protectorate of southern Nigeria, which had been smaller territorially than the protectorate of northern Nigeria, into two, with the lower Niger as the dividing line. Territorially, the northern region amounted to over 60% of Nigeria's land area, a federal structure not justified or necessitated by any ethnic, cultural, historical or geographic considerations, a deliberate imbalance that was destined to bedevil Nigeria's internal relations and politics. Each of these regions was dominated by one of the three largest nationalities of Nigeria: the House of Fulani in the northern region, the Yoruba in the western region, and the Igbo in the eastern region. The dominant, or majority, nationality of each region shared it with many smaller, or minority, nationalities. Each majority nationality controlled the government of its region, with minor places given to the minority nationalities. During the decade preceding independence, three major political parties had emerged in the country, one from each region, essentially the political mouthpiece of the majority nationality: the Northern People's Congress (NPC) of the House of Fulani, the Action Group (AG) of the Yoruba, and the National Council of Nigerian Citizens (NCNC) of the Igbo. The NPC made no effort to have any presence beyond the northern region, but the AG and NCNC sought to become nationwide and managed to establish some presence in the regions outside their bases. Elections held in 1959 produced the outcome that each party held the government of its region, while an alliance of the NPC and NCNC held the federal government, with the NPC as the larger of the two, and with the AG as official opposition, in the federal parliament. The Yoruba people shared the western region with their historically and culturally close neighbors, the Edo and Edo-related peoples of Benin Province, as well as with a cluster of smaller nationalities, Urhobo, Isoko, Ika-Igbo, Ijaw, and others, of Delta Province. The Yoruba Kingdom of Lagos, made the capital city of Nigeria by the British in 1914, continued to serve as the capital and the seat of the federal government of Nigeria into independence. The Yoruba people of the Ilorin Kingdom, many of the Igbamina kingdoms, the Ekiti Kingdom of Obo, part of the Ekiti Kingdom of Moba, and all of the Yoruba, Oworo, Jamu, Ikiri, Yagba, Gbede, Bunu of Kaba Province, formed the southwestern provinces of the northern region with its regional capital city in Kaduna, north of the Middle Niger. With these Yoruba groups absorbed into the evolving systems and politics of the northern region, the Yoruba of the western region, consisting of the kingdoms of the Ijebu, Igba, and Owu, Oyo, Ife, Ijesa, Ekiti, Ondo, Owo, Akoko, Isekiri, plus the Yoruba of the Awari kingdoms, of the federal capital territory of Lagos, became the distinct representatives and voice of the Yoruba people in the political and social history of Nigeria. The earliest flicker of Nigerian nationalist agitation against British rule was lighted by the western-educated people of the Yoruba Island Kingdom of Lagos, to which place, being the capital of Nigeria, many literate persons from other parts of Nigeria were increasingly attracted. Nationalism had started, as will be seen in the next chapter, as Yoruba cultural nationalism in the last decade of the 19th century. Before 1920 it had developed political goals. When in 1923 the British granted to the Lagos colony a constitution providing for an elected council, the politics of political parties, elections, newspapers, and mass rallies began in Lagos and provided a strong stimulus for nationalist agitation in Nigeria. Nationalist agitation soon spread to Ibadan, the highest center of British administration in the Yoruba interior, the largest city in Black Africa, and later to become the capital city of the western region. By the 1940s, nationalist politics had been introduced from Lagos to more parts of the western region as well as to the eastern and northern regions, and political parties comprising prominent Nigerians of various ethnic origins competed with one another to win the support of Lagos people and to extend their influence to the rest of Nigeria. In 1947, the most prominent of the Lagos politicians, Herbert Macaulay, grandson of Bishop Ajayi Crowther, at the head of his political party, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC, embarked on a well-publicized tour of Nigeria for these purposes, but he died before completing it. His place as leader of the NCNC was then taken by a Lagos politician of Igbo origin, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. Under the leadership of Dr. Azikiwe, the NCNC, with its name changed to National Council of Nigerian Citizens after the Southern Cameroons, which had been added to Nigeria in 1918 as a British-administered League of Nations mandated territory, voted to be separated from Nigeria in the 1950s, established branches in many towns of the western and eastern regions. With the granting of elected legislatures to the Nigerian Federation and the three regions by the 1949 Constitution, the other political parties earlier mentioned emerged: the NPC in the northern region, and the Action Group in the western region, as well as a number of smaller political parties in various parts of Nigeria. Dr. Azikiwe moved in 19,523 to head the government of the eastern region, and the effective base of the NCNC thereafter shifted to the eastern region. The years from the 1920s also witnessed the founding, by Western-educated Yoruba men and women, of local organizations named Progressive Unions or Development Associations: Ijebu Progressive Association, Ekiti Progressive Union, etc. These brought the rising literate elite of the Yoruba people together in sub-ethnic and other types of local groupings in order to consider ways to improve the quality of life of their people. Typically, the first priority of these associations was to encourage parents to send their children to school, in order to extend the benefits of education to all Yoruba people. For this important purpose, they raised funds among themselves, created scholarship programs, and organized enlightenment rallies, all of which, together, contributed considerably to giving the Yoruba people of the western region and Lagos a head start in education among the peoples of the African continent. In 194,950, a cultural organization of the educated Yoruba elite was founded, as would be remembered, with the name Egbe Omo Oduduwa, Association of Oduduwa's Descendants, to bring together educated Yorubas of all subgroups, a deliberately higher and more encompassing association of all the Yoruba elite than the progressive unions. Made up of traditional rulers and prominent Yorubas from all callings, Egbe Omo Oduduwa pursued policies and activities aimed at elevating the consciousness of a common origin and common heritage among Yoruba people. In response to the creation of the Western region, and a new constitution in 1949, the political party named the Action Group was founded by a large cross-section of the educated Yoruba elite: lawyers, doctors, teachers, pastors, journalists, business people, traditional rulers and chiefs, all under the leadership of an Ibadan-based lawyer named Obafemi Awolowo, from the small Ijebu town of Iken. The Action Group won the elections for the first elected government of the Western region in 1952, and thus produced the first elected rulers of a Yoruba state in modern times. Many significant Yoruba persons continue to be members of the NCNC, however, and the Yoruba love of freedom of choice made the Western region a bone of contention between the Action Group and the NCNC in the elections of most of the 1950s. However, slowly and laboriously, the Action Group won more and more support than the NCNC. In this, the great weapon of the Action Group leadership was its capacity to conceive, plan and execute programs of development and modernization, and to offer a very respectable government. More will be said about development later. Suffice it to say here that as the Western region became clearly the development pace-setter among the regions of Nigeria, and as the Yoruba people became more and more proud of their region, the Action Group's hold on Yoruba support became gradually unassailable, and Obafemi Awolowo as premier became a modern-day idol of many Yoruba people. When the federal election of 1959 came, the Action Group leadership, desirous of taking its vision and development capability to the management of the federal government, put up Awolowo for election to the position of Prime Minister of Nigeria. Another lawyer, Samuel Ladoke Akintoye, an experienced parliamentarian, from Ogbomoso, in the federal legislature, came back home and replaced Awolowo as Premier of the Western region. As things happened, especially since the majority of the House of Representatives belonged to the northern region, Awolowo's party did not win enough to make him Prime Minister of Nigeria, in spite of its running a noteworthy campaign. Awolowo became leader of the official opposition in the federal parliament. Meanwhile, Ladoke Akintoye brought many qualities to the position of Premier of the Western region. Endowed with impressive people skills, witty and articulate, and gifted with an extensive mastery of the Yoruba language, Akintoye quickly raised the electoral successes of the Action Group in the Western region to new heights. He also sustained with considerable credit the economic and social development programs of the regional government, in spite of some weakening of the region's revenue base owing to declines in prices of its cocoa exports in the world market. In Nigeria as a whole, however, the developing political picture was far from prosperous or happy. As the country had moved gradually towards independence during the 1950s, discordance had become an obvious fact of national life. The British, by giving Nigeria a federal structure which conferred virtually all political power on one of its three regions, had prepared the ground for conflicts and turmoil. Even as the country celebrated independence on October 1, 1960, some omen of impending crisis was inescapable. Differences in the political traditions of Nigeria's many nationalities were painfully obvious, and so were differences in their expectations and desires. Powerful undercurrents of rivalry and suspicion shaped the relationship between the major nationalities, not excluding the relationship between the House of Fulani and the Igbo, who were, meanwhile, allies in the federal government, while the minority nationalities fretted about being dominated by the majority nationalities in the regions. In the western and eastern regions, there were grave resentments caused by fears that the House of Fulani leadership of the northern region appeared bent at all costs on keeping total and perpetual hold on the federal government, with the surreptitious encouragement and assistance of the British. The fundamental roots of the Nigerian problem are to be found in the composition of the country, and the nature of the structure that the British had bestowed on it. Nigeria arrived at independence as a country of very many nationalities, each with its own culture, homeland territory, history, political traditions that had evolved over millennia, and its own type of responses to the demands and challenges of life and development in the modern world. For Nigeria to move forward with some measure of stability and coherence, the leaderships of its various peoples needed to seek, together, arrangements that were meaningful in the circumstances, seeking carefully and with deliberate deference to the nature, the traditions, the predilections, the peculiar needs, and the pride of all its nationalities, large and small. Unfortunately, in the country that the British created for Nigerians, such modes of proceeding were impossible to arrive at. The underlying principles of interrelationships in Nigeria, as they had been guided by the British before independence, were absolutely informed by ethnic power quests, dreams of ethnic dominance and brash power contests. In such a bruising atmosphere of power contests and of mutual distrust and fears, the one nationality which found itself with a chance to exercise dominance over the rest grabbed the chance and proceeded to expand it, and the rest, while swinging punches at one another, chaotically fought to resist the growing reality of domination by that one nationality. Over the years, the trend developed into a destructive tradition and took over the management of Nigeria's affairs, making a clear-sighted Nigerian leadership impossible, spawning a whole array of misguided solutions, and enthroning crookedness and corruption over Nigeria's public life as a country. One immediately touchy point in the months after independence was differences in attitudes to the obvious intention of the British to continue to mastermind Nigeria's affairs. Actions of the federal government quickly fomented a crisis from this. The House of Fulani leadership of northern Nigeria trusted the British more than it trusted the Igbo and Yoruba leaderships of eastern and western Nigeria. Through a series of acts, for example the appointment of British officials to sensitive national positions, and a military pact authorizing the establishment of British military bases on Nigerian soil, the federal government, or, more correctly, the NPC senior partner in the NPC-NCNC alliance, seemed intent on entrenching British influence over the management of Nigeria's affairs. This generated a wave of nationalist agitation, promoted by students and organized labor, endorsed by the Action Group opposition in the federal parliament, and enjoying considerable support especially among the literate people of the predominantly Yoruba Western region and Lagos. In a major step aimed at suppressing the growing movement, the two parties in power in the federal government, led by politicians from the northern and eastern regions, employed the weight of the federal government to strike with force at the Action Group federal opposition and at the western region where the Action Group was in control. Though the eastern region's Igbo leadership of the NCNC strongly suspected the NPC's every intention, they joined in the attack on the Action Group in the western region, because they calculated that their party would, with the destruction of the Action Group, at last have a chance to take over the government of the western region. It was very unfortunate for the Yoruba people that, at the very time when a potent threat was thus developing against the western region, sharp disagreements arose among its leading citizens, the leaders of the Action Group. After this disagreement blew into the open, many explanations and conjectures appeared in the news media as to the cause of it. There were many small contributing factors: personal dislikes between some persons in the outgoing Awolowo administration and the incoming Akintoye administration, resentment generated by the fact that the leading crop of Yoruba intellectuals, who had come to like working closely with and advising Awolowo as premier, continued to remain close to him rather than to the new premier, disagreements as to the influence of the party over the regional government, etc. However, a careful sifting would seem to reveal conclusively that the central factor was a growing divergence of opinions in the Action Group leadership about how to relate to, and handle, the Nigerian situation. The British, as earlier pointed out, had so ordered the political structure of Nigeria that the northern region enjoyed a strong hold on the federal government. Political leaders of southern Nigeria were dissatisfied with this, but they never seemed to be able to find unity in dealing with the threat of northern domination. The Action Group had started off very confidently, assured of its ability to make and keep the western region at the cutting edge of development and progress, in spite of the preponderance of federal power that the British had allocated to the northern region's political leadership. and the Action Group government of the Western region had recorded, and was recording, great achievements in development and progress. However, some leaders of the party gradually came to feel that, in spite of the serious objections to the Northern leaders' approach to Nigerian affairs, the Western region needed to work with the Northern leadership, in order to avoid being marginalized in the affairs of Nigeria in order, as it was commonly put, to ensure that the Western region would get its fair share of Nigeria's national cake. These leaders could point to the fact that the Igbo leadership of eastern Nigeria had been doing just that, and therefore enjoying the benefits of participation in the federal government. Such a view, however, seemed to most Action Group leaders to represent a rejection of the high visions and ethos of the Action Group, the vision and ethos that had come to make it very popular with the Yoruba people. Most Action Group leaders, including Awolowo, strongly believed that to work with the NPC on the NPC's terms, and without any prospect that the NPC would modify its position in any way, was unacceptable surrender to Northern domination, a surrender that would only encourage the Northern leadership to dig further in defense of Northern interest, a situation that would only provoke more resentment and ultimate instability in Nigeria. Many of the leaders who thought in this way would rather that the mainstream Yoruba leadership should work with the Igbo leadership of eastern Nigeria, in order to bring some equity into Nigeria's affairs. Given this growing cleavage in the Action Group, the decision to have Awolowo give up the governance of the Western region and seek federal office in 1959 was a serious mistake. Following the failure of the Action Group in that 1959 federal election, the cleavage widened rapidly, with Akintoye as premier emerging as the most important leader among those promoting what looked more and more like the dissident opinion. The group around Akintoye, including A.O. Rosiji, National Secretary of the Action Group, was displeased with the party's top leadership for not making a serious effort to work with the NPC after the 1959 election, and for negotiating with the NCNC at all since, in their view, the NCNC national leadership had always been unreliable. On the other hand, most leading members of the Action Group felt outraged by the fact that certain leaders in Akintoye's circle had, without any authority from the party, taken the step of going behind the party to hold secret negotiations with leaders of the NPC after the 1959 election. The growing disenchantment between the supporters of the opposing views led ultimately in May 1962 to a major conflict, as a result of which the majority of the party's leadership in a top meeting asked Akintoye to step down from the position of premier, to be replaced by Dauda Adebanji, a legislator from Abeokuta. With Akintoye refusing to step down, his opponents took the battle to the House of Assembly, where they intended to remove him through a resolution of the legislature. Akintoye's supporters were determined that there would be no resolution. The outcome was a rowdy and noisy clash on the floor of the House of Assembly. All this played into the hands of the NPC-NCNC controllers of the federal government, making it possible for them to step in, to declare that all law and order had broken down in the Western region, to establish a state of emergency over it, to suspend its elected government, to incarcerate its foremost politicians, and to institute over it a federally appointed emergency administration led by a Yoruba federal civil servant, Koimajekadunmi, and to use their new strong position to ensure that the division in the leadership of the Yoruba people would grow deeper and become permanent. Split from the main body of the Action Group, Akintoye formed a new party of his own, first the United People's Party UPP, and then the Nigerian National Democratic Party NNDP. Akintoye then took his party into an alliance with the NPC. Awolowo and the rest of the Action Group then became, openly, the principal target of the federal attack on the Western region. An investigation, executed by a commission of inquiry chaired by a certain Justice G.B. Coker, was instituted into the management of the Western region, covering only the years under Awolowo's premiership. While that was still going on, the federal government indicted Awolowo with treasonable felony charges, an action which most Yoruba people believed to be groundless and to be motivated only by politics. Then followed a court trial in which Awolowo was denied legal defense of his choice, and in which the federal authorities seemed bent on manipulating the outcome. At the expiration of the emergency administration in January 1963, large numbers of citizens of the Western region urged the federal government to order new elections, so that they might elect a new representative government for their region. The federal government ignored this outcry and simply reinstalled Akintoye as premier. And then the criminal case against Awolowo was concluded, and he was convicted and imprisoned. And then also, the federal government separated the Benin and Delta provinces from the Western region and constituted them into a new region named the Midwestern region, an action which made the Western region an exclusively Yoruba region, and which most Yoruba people saw as having the objective of reducing their weight and influence in the affairs of Nigeria. The vast majority of the Yoruba citizens of the Western region took these federal actions as an affront on the Yoruba nation, and a mighty crisis developed. The elections that came in 1964 and 1965 finally brought the crisis to a violent outcome. In the federal election of 1964, with Akintoye's party, the NNDP in alliance with the NPC, the Yoruba people of the Western region encountered, for the first time in their history of participation in modern democratic elections, the use of governmental powers to distort the processes and results of an election in order to give the NPC and NDP alliance victory in the Western region. Most Yoruba people attributed this to the influence of the NPC, and the anger generated by it prepared the ground for the Western regional elections due in October 1965. When, in the 1965 election, the same manipulations of 1964 were replicated on a bigger and more blatant scale to give the NNDP victory over the Action Group, the crisis in the region exploded into a great conflagration. For 3 months, violent protests ravaged the Western region and parts of the Federal Territory of Lagos, resulting in the killing of countless persons and the burning of countless houses of members of Akintoye's party and of officials believed to have taken part in rigging the election. In the process, the authority of the regional and federal governments disintegrated in many parts of the Western region. In desperation, the federal government increasingly brought the Nigerian armed forces into the maintenance of law and order, thus unwittingly inviting the armed forces into intervention in the politics of the country. Ultimately, early in the morning of January 16, 1966, the Nigerian armed forces struck, and seized control of the federal government and all the regional governments of Nigeria. In the bloody process of military seizure of power, Adebanji Akintoye lost his life. The Yoruba, acting through a sizable majority, had thus made their point and, as they saw it, upheld their dignity as a nation. But they had done it at a cost in lost lives and lost properties, and, more importantly, in an unmistakable loss of Yoruba political unity. In spite of the participation of the Yoruba political elite in different political parties from 1951 to 1962, the general spirit of Yoruba national political solidarity developing from the late 19th century, and the focus of Yoruba leadership on the development and progress of Yoruba society, had, on the whole, stayed alive and well. In 196,266, however, all of that suffered a serious setback. While that setback was engineered by the forces at work in Nigerian politics, most observers were nevertheless surprised by the ease with which the modern Yoruba leadership succumbed and allowed itself to fall apart in 196,266. The political hangover from that crisis continued, till the end of the century, to becloud the behavior and image of the Yoruba in the politics of Nigeria and to dilute the influence that they deserve to have in Nigeria's affairs. On the whole, the Yoruba West in Nigeria ceased being the place to emulate in matters of political order and stability and in matters of socio-economic development, and became one of the constant centers of the truculence and violence that increasingly came to characterize Nigeria's politics and national life as the 20th century ended and the 21st opened. At the turn of the century, the political leaders of the Yoruba people showed no serious signs of being able to ameliorate this political climate of their homeland, but increasingly seemed vulnerable to the negative forces at work in Nigerian politics. After his release from prison in August 1966, Awolowo emerged from the 196,266 crisis as the hero of most Yoruba people. To most, the years of his premiership of the Western region, 195,259, came to be seen as the golden age of modern Yoruba history. More and more for the rest of the 20th century, Yoruba people, especially the highly educated elite, hailed his 195,259 management of the affairs of the Western region as a faithful synthesis and demonstration of Yoruba character and political principles usually stated as the principles of respect for the people's sovereignty and for the law, a dedication to democracy and to accountability, seriousness and exalted conduct in the running of public affairs, and dedication of government policies and actions to the improvement of the people's quality of life. After he was released from prison, Awolowo became far and away the most influential Yoruba in the affairs of Nigeria and one of the most revered political figures in Nigeria. Most Yoruba people harbored the expectation that whenever Nigeria returned to civilian rule, Awolowo would at last have the chance to bring the high principles that he represented into the governance of Nigeria. However, there were significant and influential pockets of opposition to Awolowo, as would be seen later. The old inter-ethnic rivalries and animosities were still very much alive, which meant that, when the time came for civilian politics, Awolowo would be powerfully resisted by the Hausa Fulani leadership of northern Nigeria and the Igbo leadership of eastern Nigeria. But more importantly, mostly as a consequence of the 196,266 Western region crisis, there were some prominent and influential Yoruba persons who were strongly, even bitterly, opposed to Awolowo. As for Nigeria as a country, the national crisis that thus started in 1962 never cleared throughout the rest of the 20th century. The military ruled for 13 years, until 1979. The first 4 years of military rule saw the national crisis escalate to its very worst. Not long after coming to power in January 1966, the federal military government, led by a military officer of Igbo origin, General Johnson Ogiye Ironside, adopted some measures that denuded the regions of their powers and seemed to threaten the establishment of unitary rule over the country. Leading politicians and citizens of the northern region especially had good reason to fear that some of these measures were aimed specifically at their region. In particular, Ironside's decree unifying the top levels of the civil service of the regional governments of Nigeria seemed clearly to threaten the takeover of the civil service of the northern region by the more academically qualified civil servants from southern Nigeria. In this circumstance, the fact that the leaders of the January coup had been mostly Igbo, and that the coup had eliminated the most important House of Fulani leader, Sir Ahmadu Bello, premier of the northern region, and a major Yoruba leader, Chief Akintoye, and not a single Igbo leader, came to be seen in the north as proof that the coup was an Igbo coup. Massive protests arose in the northern region resulting in a widespread massacre of Igbo citizens of the eastern region living in the northern region. A group of soldiers of northern region origin and overthrew the Ironside regime in July 1966, and pushed aside the Yoruba military officer, Brigadier Babafemi Ogundipe, who was next in rank to Ironside. In fact, Ogundipe faced threats to his life at the hands of the northern coup makers and had to flee into exile. The northern officers then installed one of their men, a comparatively junior officer named Yakubu Gan, then a lieutenant colonel, in Ironside's place. Even with the northern region's military men in control of the federal government, more massacres of Igbos erupted in the northern region. From the northern region, and then from the other regions, members of the Igbo nationality fled to their region, creating a big refugee crisis there. Under such painful pressures, the leadership of the eastern region slowly came to the conclusion that their people could never again find safety in Nigeria. In May 1967 therefore, they announced to the world that the eastern region was seceding from Nigeria and taking its place in the world as an autonomous country with the name Biafra. The federal military government immediately responded with two actions: first, an announcement dividing Nigeria into 12 states, 3 in the eastern region, 3 in the old western region and Lagos, and 6 in the northern region, obviously for the purpose of weakening the hold of the Igbo leadership on the non-Igbo peoples of the eastern region, and, secondly, an invasion of the eastern region. Nigeria thus plunged into civil war, a war that was destined to continue until January 1970. As the war started, the new Yoruba Western and Lagos states found themselves in a precarious position. For one thing, although there were many Yoruba in the officer ranks of the Nigerian army, there were almost none in the lower combat ranks because Yoruba people had generally avoided seeking service at those lower levels of the military. As a result, Yorubaland found itself at the mercy of tens of thousands of troops of northern origin, deployed to police and defend the western and Lagos states. Moreover, most Yoruba people believed that, in spite of Nigeria's obvious downsides, the country was worth preserving, that if properly and decently managed, as the western region had been until the outbreak of the 1962 crisis, it had the capabilities to develop into a great power in the world and a land of opportunity for all its citizens. Also, Yoruba feelings were revolted by the brutalities and killings that Igbo people had been subjected to in the northern region. As crowds of wounded and traumatized Igbo men, women and children, fleeing from the northern region, had come through parts of the western region on their way to the eastern region, relief teams had sprung up in Yoruba towns to offer them help and food, and to dress their wounds. In the months before the declaration of Biafra and the outbreak of war, the military governor of the western region, Brigadier, later General, Adeyinka Adebayo, had spoken fervently for reconciliation and peace in federal councils. At home in the western region, he had urged his people against any violence against the Igbo and Yoruba towns and villages. And Obafemi Awolowo, recently released from prison, had added his voice to that of the military governor. As a result, Igbo people had been safe in the western region and Lagos. Those who had fled from there had done so only out of fear of soldiers of northern region origin still deployed in Yorubaland. To change that situation, representatives of the eastern, western and midwestern states got the Federal Military Council to take the decision to redeploy all Nigerian soldiers to their regions of origin. Also, prominent Yoruba citizens of all political persuasions, acting together in their gathering known as Yoruba Leaders of Thought, under Awolowo's chairmanship, urged the federal military government of Yakubu Gowon to redeploy all northern soldiers from the west and Lagos to their own region, and to authorize the recruitment of Yorubas to the army to police the western region and Lagos. Though Gan's responses to these demands were always positive, he never took the actions demanded. His failure in this matter contributed greatly to Yoruba feelings that his federal government was an agent of the northern leadership, and the feelings of the Igbo leadership that their people could never hope to be safe in the rest of Nigeria. And these fears of the Igbo people were destined ultimately to lead to secession and to civil war. In general, as the civil war began, the Gan government, under the influence of advisers who feared that Yoruba support for the federal cause was doubtful, operated in suspicion and fear of the broad generality of Yoruba people, and sustained the hold of the northern soldiers on the western and Lagos states, a situation which Awolowo categorized as reducing Yorubaland to a protectorate in independent Nigeria. All of that, however, was soon to change. In July 1967, Midwestern military officers sympathetic to the Biafran cause overthrew the military government of the Midwest state, and elements of the Biafran army poured over the Onitsha Bridge across the lower Niger, occupied the Midwest, and penetrated some distance into the southern parts of the western state, Ile-Ife, Ikale and the southern Ondo forests. That, for the Yoruba people, created a totally unexpected situation. As the war had started, Biafra had stridently called on Yoruba people to revolt and declare their secession from Nigeria. Suddenly, however, with the Biafran occupation of the Midwest and thrust into Yorubaland, it seemed to Yoruba people in general that the western and Lagos states, and the federal capital city of Lagos itself, would be occupied by Biafra too, and nobody could be sure what the Igbo leadership of Biafra would do to Yorubaland from that position of strength. Consequently, the Yoruba people of the western and Lagos states became gripped by a feverish resolve to defend their territory. The federal military government also changed course immediately and, among other things, ordered a general mobilization, thus opening the door to recruitment of Yoruba people into the army. In towns and villages all over the western and Lagos states, Yoruba youths formed long lines at recruitment centers, eager to enlist for the defense of their homeland. They proved to be what the desperate federal situation needed. Products of the Western region's free primary education program, about which more will be said later, they were easy to train quickly and deploy, and their coming rolled the Nigerian army forward. Thrusts from various directions were then made into the eastern region, many of which thrusts were commanded by Yoruba officers, of whom some, like Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, Lieutenant Colonel Aorio, Colonel Olufemi Akintoye and Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo, became household names throughout the country on account of their accomplishments in the war. Also, very importantly, in order to generate popular support for the federal war effort, Gan, by then, General Gan, invited some prominent civilians to join his war cabinet, and appointed Awolowo to the highest position in it as Commissioner for Finance and Vice Chairman of the Supreme Military Council. With the appointment of Chief Awolowo, the management of the war finances came into the hands of the man acclaimed by many in his own lifetime and after his death as a masterful statesman, visionary and administrator in the 20th century history of Nigeria. With prominent civilians in the military administration, the federal government's management of the war changed greatly for the better. Much of that was, according to all reports, due to Chief Awolowo's leadership qualities and to the unity of purpose exhibited by the civilian leaders in the war cabinet. The people of eastern Nigeria, acquitting themselves very creditably against the overwhelming resources of the federal government, kept fighting for over 2 more years. When the war finally ended, Obasanjo received their surrender in the field, and the pieces of the shattered country began to come slowly together again. As soon as the war ended, Awolowo, saying that he was satisfied that the objective of the inclusion of civilians in the war cabinet had been fulfilled, offered his resignation from the Gan administration. For the Yoruba people, perhaps the most important developments of the Civil War period were, first, the emergence of 2 states that were fully Yoruba out of the 12 states of the Federation, namely, Lagos State and the Western State, and secondly, the presence of Yoruba citizens in the armed forces in numbers almost commensurate with their numerical strength in Nigeria. A third state, Kwara, with headquarters at Ilorin, was a predominantly Yoruba state. In the years that followed, this creation of states by Gan came to convince most Nigerians that splitting the country into smaller states was good for economic development and political stability. Therefore, more states came to be later created. By the year 2000, the Nigerian Federation consisted of 36 states. Of these, 6 were fully Yoruba states, namely, Lagos, with its capital at Ikeja, Ogun, with its capital at Abeokuta, Oyo, with its capital at Ibadan, Osun, with its capital at Osogbo, Ondo, with its capital at Akure, and Ekiti, with its capital at Ado-Ekiti. One other state, Kwara State, with its capital at Ilorin, was predominantly Yoruba. Another state, Kogi State, with its capital at Lokoja, had a strong Yoruba component, while Delta State had a small Yoruba component, namely, the Itsekiri. As soon as the war ended, Gan promised to embark on steps that would lead to a new constitution, and the return to democratically elected government. However, year followed year and Gan showed hardly any sign of bringing an end to military rule. As a result, he lost all credibility and popularity, and therefore, 5 years after the war, another group of military officers overthrew him on July 29, 1975. The new administration, led by another northern officer, Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Muhammad, won immediate and widespread admiration by promising an end to the sordid corruption that had become the mark of the post-war military administration, and by offering a program of return to democratic civilian government. Less than 1 year later, on February 13, 1976, Murtala Muhammad was assassinated by another group of mostly northern military officers trying to take over. The takeover attempt failed, and Murtala's deputy, Olusegun Obasanjo, a Yoruba officer, assumed leadership of the country, promising to implement the Murtala program of return to civilian rule. Since northern military officers continued to be the most influential bloc in the Nigerian army, people have wondered why Obasanjo was allowed to assume leadership of the country in 1976. One probability is that, because he had been the most prominent Nigerian military officer in the last stages of the war against Biafra, the officer who had received the Biafran surrender in the field, he commanded some respect in the army. Some other observers have also suggested that military people close to him perceived him as a man with little or no emotional attachment to his ethnic roots, a sort of detribalized Nigerian, and that image made him acceptable. But some have added that he was not only perceived as detribalized, but actually as one of the Yoruba strongly hostile to Awolowo, and therefore, a man who could be relied upon not to promote any Awolowo or Yoruba agenda in Nigerian affairs. In support of this latter, it is usually pointed out that Obasanjo, in and out of office, never openly, in writing and other ways, evinced any measurable warmth towards Yoruba group aspirations or interests. In 1979, with Obasanjo as military ruler of Nigeria, elections were held for a civilian government under a new constitution modeled after the American presidential system. In the 1979 elections, the political party founded and led by Awolowo, the Unity Party of Nigeria, UPN, was one of the 5 political parties registered under the electoral law. It soon became clear that 2 of these, the UPN and the National Party of Nigeria, NPN, founded and led by the House of Fulani leadership of northern Nigeria, stood high above the other 3. The UPN swept the then 4 Yoruba states of western Nigeria, as well as the Midwestern region then known as Bendel State, winning all the governorships, virtually all the membership of some of the state legislatures, and nearly all legislative seats in the Federal National Assembly, and giving Awolowo very massive majorities in the presidential election. This was an unprecedented demonstration of Yoruba political unity in modern times, but it narrowly failed to give Awolowo a decisive victory in the race for the presidency of Nigeria, since his votes in the other parts of Nigeria did not sufficiently help. Of the 5 candidates for the presidency, neither of the 2 frontrunners, Shagari from northern Nigeria and Obafemi Awolowo from western Nigeria, won decisively, and, in accordance with the electoral law, a runoff between the 2 became necessary. As things stood, and with the alliances emerging after the presidential votes were all announced, Awolowo seemed likely to win a runoff election. However, the military administration under Obasanjo intervened with a novel, and very questionable, reinterpretation of the electoral law in order to prevent a runoff election. The electoral law had stipulated that a number of issues would be decided if supported by 2/3 of the then 19 states of Nigeria. From the Constituent Assembly which had created the Constitution and the electoral laws, through the preparation for elections, and throughout the process of the elections, 2/3 of 19 states had been universally and pointedly interpreted as 13 states. The electoral law provided that, to be validly elected as Nigeria's president, a candidate must win not less than 1/4 of the votes cast in at least 2/3 of the 19 states. Shagari, the NPN candidate, won the required 1/4 in 12 states, with Awolowo coming close behind. For 2 days, the Electoral Commission appeared to be preparing for the announcement for a runoff election, and all parties began to prepare for one. Suddenly, officials of Shagari's party, notably Richard Akintoye, legal advisor to the NPN, came up with the proposal that 2/3 of 19 states was no longer 13 states, but 12 states plus 2/3 of one state, and that since Shagari had won 1/4 of the votes cast in 12 states and 1/4 of 2/3 of the votes cast in a 13th state, he should be deemed as elected. To the shock of most Nigerians, Obasanjo accepted this truncated interpretation and had Shagari proclaimed as elected, drawing violent denunciations from all the other political parties. In the context of Yoruba history, it is significant that the two persons most responsible for this manipulation of the electoral law in 1979 were Yoruba, General Obasanjo, and Richard Akintoye. Akintoye was one of Nigeria's most senior legal practitioners. He had belonged to the NCNC in the 1950s, and had later joined Akindele's NNDP in 1963. A man of outstanding intellect, Akintoye was one of Nigeria's best lawyers. For some years he was president of the Nigerian Bar Association. In the 1979 elections, he had stood as NPN candidate for the governorship of Oyo State, and had lost heavily to another first-rate lawyer, Ile-Ife, candidate for Awolowo's party, the UPN. Thus the elections of 1979 clearly exhibited the two contrasting realities in Yoruba political life in Nigeria. First, a very solid unity of the generality of Yoruba people, a unity around strongly held principles and expectations, and second, a stubborn, and often hostile, strain of dissidents in sections of the very top of modern Yoruba political leadership, most of it a carryover from the 196,266 Western region situation. Admirers of the modern Yoruba people have often expressed surprise that this cohesive and high-achieving people has somehow seemed to lack the capacity to deal with serious internal divisions that happen to arise, a weakness that has often hurt their interests in the affairs of multinational Nigeria, and that has repeatedly compromised their success in doing what they have been demonstrably best at doing, namely, developing and enriching their society. The politics of the Shagari presidency proceeded to work against the Yoruba parts of Nigeria. Belonging to a party that was the leading rival of Shagari's party, the governments of the Yoruba states encountered serious difficulties, especially with inadequate funding for the programs that their people cherished. Nevertheless, each of the four governors, Lateef Jakonde in Lagos State, Bisi Onabanjo in Ogun State, Bola Ige in Oyo State, and Adekunle Ajasin in Ondo State, doggedly pursued policies that sustained, and even expanded the scope of, free education, improved the quality of healthcare delivery and of the transportation systems. Jakonde, who became known as Action Governor, performed a near miracle with the Lagos schools system, providing temporary facilities that enabled the state to bring immediately to an end the confusing double-stream practice whereby some Lagos children had gone to school in the morning and the rest in the afternoon, a practice which had meant that neither stream had been able to learn effectively. Jakonde also created housing estates, and considered a tram system as a solution to the chronic traffic jams that had long plagued Lagos. He was not able to carry the tram project to conclusion. However, he founded a university for his state, and so too did the other three state governors for their states. Again, the mood characteristic of the 195,262 Western region began to reappear in these four states, the mood of confidence in leadership, achievements and orderly progress. But it was all destined to be very brief. With the NPN federal government and NPN party operatives always pointedly posing a threat to the four Yoruba state governments, some persons in two of the state governments, Oyo and Ondo, ambitious for election as governors come 1983, were encouraged to become excessive and even disruptive in pushing their ambitions against their governors. Assured that the NPN would use its federal powers to rig elections for its candidates, every one of these persons ultimately decamped and became NPN candidates or NPN strategists when the 1983 elections came. All these things developed in a countrywide political atmosphere in which all other political parties were raising alarms about the NPN's use of the Nigerian police and other institutions of the federal government to rig elections. In the end, the election manipulations were successfully pushed through in gubernatorial elections in both Oyo State and Ondo State, provoking some popular commotions in both states. The commotion in Ondo State proved particularly cataclysmic, resulting, in one single morning, in the killing of tens of persons believed to be implicated in the rigging of the election, the burning of their houses, and the death of many young demonstrators in clashes with the police in the streets. The courts of law later reversed the result of the gubernatorial election in Ondo State, but not in Oyo State. But neither of these had any real significance ultimately. In response to the sullen mood pervading most of the country, the Nigerian military stepped in again on December 30, 1983, and seized control of the federal and state governments. The new military government, led by Muhammadu Buhari from the north, with Tunde Diagbon, a Yoruba officer from Kwara State, as his deputy, lasted only about 19 months. In August 1985, it was overthrown by another group of military officers led by Ibrahim Babangida, also from the north. The Babangida administration ordered the writing of yet another constitution and general elections to be held in 199,093. The elections to the local governments and the state governments were conducted in 199,092, and the election of the President of Nigeria came on June 12, 1993. Of the two political parties, the National Republican Convention (NRC), and the Social Democratic Party (SDP), which confronted each other in the presidential election, the NRC put forward Bashir Tofa, a northerner, as its candidate, and the SDP Ko Abiola, a Yoruba from the west. As the results of the election came to be released in various parts of the country in the course of the days following June 12, Abiola quickly emerged as the overwhelming winner, even in the north and the east. This, for a Yoruba man, was a political feat of historic proportions, something that no Yoruba person had ever achieved. Many factors worked in Abiola's favor. First, he was a very rich man with enormous personal funds to draw upon. Secondly, being an open-handed person by nature, he had given to a lot of causes and persons in most parts of the country, and was widely regarded as a philanthropist. Thirdly, he had a very thick web of social relationships spanning most parts of the country. As a prominent leader in the Muslim community in Nigeria, he had developed strong friendships in the predominantly Muslim north, while the fact that one of his wives was of Igbo descent gave him family relationships in the east. But all of these were not as important as two other factors. The first was the very solid support that he enjoyed at home in the west. Abiola had been alienated from the mainstream Yoruba political elite led by Chief Awolowo in the 1970s, because he had been a leading member of the NPN and had very noticeably worked against Awolowo's 1979 presidential candidacy. By 1991, however, he had managed to make his peace with the very powerful mainstream Yoruba elite and its Awolowo heritage. After the SDP nominated him as presidential candidate in 1992, the party rolled out their powerful political machine in his support all over the country, and that meant, among other things, that the masses of the Yoruba people, who were mainly SDP, went out and voted overwhelmingly for him. The other very important factor was that the northern, House of Fulani, political elite mostly continued to see Abiola as what he had always been, a Muslim friend and ally. Therefore, even though they supported Tofa's candidacy, they did not show any marked hostility towards Abiola's. By the time most of the electoral results were published, Abiola's overwhelming victory was beyond doubt. Abiola was the first Nigerian politician ever to receive such strong electoral support in all parts of the country. In the opinion of virtually all Nigerians, and of foreign observers who came from many countries and international agencies, many at the invitation of the Nigerian government, the presidential election of June 12, 1993 was free and fair, and without disturbances or violence. Yet, a few days later, the authorities of the federal military government announced cancellation of the election without giving any clear reason other than some criticism of Abiola as a person. Protests and demonstrations followed in many parts of the country, and a pro-democracy movement emerged with the name National Democratic Coalition, with strong units all over the country, but with Lagos and many Yoruba cities as its most determined base. By winning the presidential election and becoming the first Yoruba man to perform such a feat, Abiola became an icon of Yoruba political success in the context of Nigeria, and the Yoruba political elite, strongly backed by the masses of Yoruba people, showed in every way that they would not let themselves be denied or robbed once again. Unable to continue in such circumstances, Babangida stepped down and, in a move calculated to appease the Yoruba elite, handed over to an interim administration led by a non-partisan Yoruba civilian, Ernest Shonkan, a highly respected businessman who had served with distinction as chief executive officer of the UAC Group, one of the largest companies in Nigeria, and also as chairman of the Federal Economic Advisory Board under Babangida. 3 months later, however, General Sani Abacha, yet another northern officer, Babangida's former chief of staff and a member of the Shonkan interim government, stepped forward, seized control, dissolved the interim government, and proclaimed himself president. To suppress the pro-democracy movement, which then became very formidable, Abacha instituted a reign of terror, detaining many prominent citizens without trial, and charging many more with high crimes. Many military officers were accused of attempting to overthrow Abacha's regime, and were tried and executed, or imprisoned, some of the latter dying in prison. Assassination squads went after leading citizens, some of whom fell to their bullets. Abiola was arrested and detained in prison for continuing to claim victory in the election. Thousands of the Nigerian intellectual and political elite, most of them Yoruba, fled the country. It looked as if the country would not survive the Abacha terror, as talk of secession or dissolution began to be heard from various quarters. Leading Yoruba citizens who were still able to stay in the country started to meet to consider the future of the Yoruba people, and founded various Yoruba organizations, notably, Afenifere, a name called from Awolowo's 1951 political party, Action Group, known in Yoruba as Egbe Afenifere, the group that seeks the welfare of all. Obafemi Awolowo had died in 1987, One of his old associates, Michael Adekunle from Owo, former governor of Ondo State, became leader of Afenifere. A group of Yoruba youths, led by Dr. Frederick Fain, formed a militant organization and called it Ajwa People's Congress, for the defense of Yoruba interests. In many countries of the world, Yoruba residents held meetings and formed associations of descendants of Oduduwa to respond to the situation in Nigeria. As the heat rose, however, Abika died suddenly on June 8, 1998, probably from a heart attack. Abika's sudden death saved Nigeria from dissolution or another civil war, but it did not change the fundamental trends of Nigeria's political life. MKO Abiola died too while still in prison. The military officer who took over after Abika, General Abdul Salam Abubakar, also a northerner, organized another presidential election in 1999. General Abubakar was the last military ruler of Nigeria in the 20th century, but General Abika's violent regime marked the climax of the military impact on the country's political history. All in all, the heritage of the military was a serious distortion of the direction of Nigeria's political development. Military rule destroyed the intrinsic essence of Nigeria's federalism by gradually vesting virtually all effective authority in the federal government and relegating the component states of the federation to a lowly subordinate status. The popularly welcomed act of creation of more states was usually seized upon by military rulers as an occasion to weaken the resulting states, arrogate more authority to the federal center, and take over assets created and owned by the regions or the states. The fact that the revenue accruing to Nigeria from the rents and commissions on the petroleum industry must first be collected by the federal authority before distribution among the governments of the federation became a powerful tool in the hands of the federal government for holding on to a grossly disproportionate share of the national revenue, and often reducing the states to beggar members of the federation. As a result, while the federal government operated in enormous excess, waste and corruption, the states regularly suffered drastic inadequacy of funds for their essential services. The first military governors of the regions after the first military takeover of government in January 1966 were citizens of the regions to which they were posted, persons who belonged to the culture of the regions they were asked to rule, who could relate to the needs of their regions and respond to the expectations of the people they ruled. After this first generation of military governors, the military gradually saw to it that military governors were foreigners to the states to which they were posted, hence, the frequent appointment of governors with little or no understanding of the states they were supposed to rule and with little loyalty to the people they ruled. As a result, the governors became hardly better than federal agents in the states. By the time of Abika, Nigeria was a federation only in name. An ill-conceived process of national unification or integration was in progress, resulting in the virtual death of the loyalty, passion, and accountability that had moved the regions forward in the years 195,265, and the emergence of a political leadership with no firm roots among, and very little loyalty to, the governed.